If you want to play Warhammer 40k, then you're going to need to choose which army to collect, and there's a whole ton of choice out there. Let's take a talk through the Dark Millennium, and talk through the pros and cons of collecting each faction in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a big overview of Warhammer 40k in general, talking through each and every army in the game, and just doing a bit of an introduction to each faction, and why you might want to collect them. I generally try and update this video each year as so much seems to change. This time round we've got a couple of new factions in Votann and soon to be World Eaters entering centre stage, plus we've had a massive amount of points changes and codex increases and things that change the way that you play the armies in the game. First up, just for a bit of general advice that always comes up whenever I make one of these videos, obviously just play the army that you like. You certainly can overthink things. Some armies do have a lot going for them in terms of things like game rules and being a lot cheaper to put on the table, but I feel like if you convince yourself into playing an army that you don't really like the lore of or the appearance of the models, that's generally going to be a decision that comes back to bite you. That being said, obviously there's all sorts of reasons that you could choose to pick one army over another. The models and the looks, the lore and the background of the faction and what they do in the story, the rules and game mechanics and roughly what they try and do on the tabletop, whether they're slow tanky elites or fast fragile hard-hitting melee troops. The army's in-game power is certainly something that sways people. Generally people don't like to lose, but on the other hand I would bear in mind that this will definitely change as rules progress. Armies in 40k get stronger and weaker all the time, and you can't guarantee that something is going to remain strong indefinitely. The price is also a factor as well. Some armies just cost significantly less than others, things like Custodes or Knights compared with Admech or Imperial Guard perhaps, and also some people might just prefer smaller and a bit more easily manageable armies, not having vast hordes of troopers to paint up, or armies with particularly complex rules mechanics. In general, if I was just jumping into a faction in 40k, I'd generally recommend probably picking up the codex for a bit of a read over and research into their rules, and probably something like a basic box of troops to try them out and paint up a few, and get a feel if you want to jump into the faction in full. I probably wouldn't go and buy an entire army in one fell swoop unless you're very experienced. First up, before we get into the details, let's just go over the Warhammer 40k faction list in general. For the most part, this is split into 3 separate sub-factions: the Imperium, the forces of the main human empire with the Emperor at its head, theoretically the good guys, but they get up to all sorts of dodgy stuff in the name of humanity's defense. Then there's the Chaos, followers of the 4 gods of the ruinous powers, and then there's the Xenos, the alien empires of things like Tau and Necrons and Orks, plus humans who have diverged too far from main humanity seem to wind up here, as Genestealer Cults and Leagues of Votann seem to be categorised as such. For the Imperium, we've got the power-armoured Space Marines with a ton of different chapters, 12 if you're including Grey Knights, plus some sub-factions. The Adepta Sororitas, Sisters of Battle, the Adeptus Mechanicus, machine god followers of the Omnissiah, the Astra Militarum, the rugged military of man, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's Golden Legion, the Imperial Knights, the massive great super heavy war machines, and Imperial Agents, broadly agents that ally to or lead the other armies, things like Inquisition, Assassins or Rogue Traders. For the forces of Chaos, foremost amongst them are the Chaos Marines that fell in the Horus Heresy, several legions in the main codex with their own bespoke rules, but also Death Guard, Thousand Sons, and soon-to-be World Eaters, who have more divergent models and lore and have their own codexes, or are soon to have one. There's then the Chaos Demons, the actual physical manifestations of the gods themselves, and Chaos Knights, the fallen counterpart of the massive Imperial Walkers. Finally, we've got the Xenos, various factions of Eldar, the somber and aloof Craftworlders, the nightmarish and depraved Drukhari Torturers, the enigmatic Harlequin performers of the Black Library, and the Eldar death cult of the Ynnari. There's then the ravenous alien Tyranids and their Genestealer Cult mutated humans, the young and technologically adept Tau Empire, the cloned and cybernetically augmented space dwarves in the Leagues of Votann, the fungal death machines of the Orks, and the ancient undead robot skeletons of the Necrons. It really has grown out to be a bit of a list, so let's talk through the factions one by one. First up, and just generally always at the forefront of Warhammer 40k, are the Space Marines. These guys are the genetically engineered super soldiers in power armour that's generally humanity's finest troops. The Space Marines are typically organised into their own monastic knightly chapters with their own heraldry, fighting styles and flaws. Even a single warrior is a formidable foe, superhuman in every sense of the word, heightened senses, faster reflexes, and much more raw might, and fighting with some of the deadliest weapons that humanity can equip them with, including the mighty bolter with its explosive shells. The enemies of the Emperor certainly fear the wrath of the Space Marines. Miniatures wise, the Marines certainly are the army that gets the most love from Games Workshop. They've got far more kits than any of the other factions, including a whole ton of recent stuff where basically Games Workshop have been gradually refreshing the range by releasing their new Primaris Space Marines, bigger and with a slightly more sleek and less cluttered aesthetic for the most part. They often have multiple units that fill just about every battlefield role that you can think of. A lot of the stuff is kind of new, but there's a fair few relics in the range of some fairly old plastic kits and a few bits of resin as well. The Games Workshop do seem to be perhaps slowly phasing out. The range is kind of split at the moment between the Primaris and the Firstborn Space Marines that came before them. It's certainly not impossible in the future that Games Workshop might be gradually starting to retire the older Marines, and we might wind up with a situation where everything is Primaris at some point in the future. Could be something to be aware of if jumping into the faction, though that could still be quite a long time away. Price-wise, Space Marines are about as cheap as it gets for Warhammer 40k. They're fairly big chunky elite units for the most part, and tend to have at least a fair amount of points that you get for the money that you spend, so an army tends to cost a bit less. Being the poster boys of 40k, they also have all sorts of discount deals available. They get a whole ton of Space Marine Combat Patrol box sets, which are Games Workshop's discount sets, and they also appear in the starter boxes. Rules-wise, their current rules are in Codex Space Marines, plus they have a system of supplement books where basically you have the main codex and then you have additional books for the individual chapters if you want more in-depth rules for them. Can just be a little bit annoying getting hold of the rules. Games Workshop does have a bit of a habit of rewriting the Space Marine Codex quite regularly as well. In-game, they're typically quite tactically balanced. They can either hit very hard at range or in melee, usually favouring a fighting style of decisive strikes, but you really can tailor a force to build around some very different themes, either going all in on combat troops or range for example, or even doing other things like guerrilla warfare, or tank and vehicle heavy armies. Horde troops are perhaps the main thing that they don't do, I guess. Currently power-wise, unfortunately Space Marines are about as weak as it gets right now. A lot of their Codex datasheets are just a bit underpowered compared with all of the nasty stuff that came out after them in 9th edition. Games Workshop has said that they're going to be doing some points rewrites in January though, which hopefully should give them a bit of a shot in the arm. They're also rumoured to have a fair few of their core Codex supplements redone in the not too distant future. In general, if you want a very good model range, hard-hitting elites, and a fairly cheap army to play, Space Marines are really quite a tempting choice. Just for practical purposes, they are maybe one of the easiest armies to get a collection together of. Next up, I thought I'd briefly talk through the major Space Marine chapters. As mentioned, they have their own supplement books and at least one unique miniature in each chapter. Some have many, many more. Broadly speaking, I'd group them into the less divergent chapters that tend to follow the Codex Astartes a bit more closely, and then the ones that really just go off and do their own thing. Previously they had standalone codexes, now they've been rolled into the main one with their supplement, but they still have a whole ton of their own unique units. Going through the less divergent chapters first up we have the Ultramarines, perhaps the poster boys of 40k. These guys hail from a civilized and fairly industrious section of the galaxy called Ultramar, and have a fair few Roman themes going on in their heraldry and naming and stuff. They're perhaps notable as the sons of Rabute Gilliman, the author of the Codex Astartes, who has returned to become Lord Commander of the Imperium. In battle they tend to be fairly balanced and favour tactical flexibility above all, and are renowned exemplars of battle strategy in general. The White Scars are kind of Mongols in space, a fast and fairly brutal melee chapter with a great liking of bikes and mass charges, maybe a bit less well represented than the Ultramarines on the model front who have a whole ton of characters. These guys just have Corsaro Khan here, though he is a very nice miniature in my opinion. Next up we've got the Raven Guard, the black-clad stealth chapter. They specialise in lightning raids with jump packs leaping from the shadows and cutting the enemy to shreds before retreating again before the enemy can counterattack. They've only got the one proper unique character model in Kayvan Shrike here, who's their chapter master. Unfortunately for them, I would say they're probably a bit weaker than most in 9th edition at the moment. Their rules just don't stack up to as much as some of the other chapters. The Iron Hands believe that their flesh is weak. They have a habit of replacing their body parts with cybernetically augmented bits, like bionic arms and things. In battle, they follow merciless logic patterns, and typically prefer hosing down the enemy with heavy firepower from Devastator squads and things, and employ a great amount of armoured vehicles. Again, they've just got the one unique miniature in Ironfather Phyros, and overall I'd say that the army is perhaps stronger than most at the moment. They've got some really powerful options both at range and even in combat, and are particularly good at fighting with armoured vehicles. The Salamanders are the green-clad sons of Vulcan. They favour raw might and toughness combined with brutal fire, having a great amount of flamer and melter weapons within their armies. It's reflected in their rules where those weapons get extra nasty, though maybe do have a few less options for things like speed or redeployment compared with some. Again, they've got a couple of character miniatures. The Imperial Fists are the yellow-clad Bolter and Siege Legion of Rogel Dawn. Again, they're one of the Space Marine chapters that favours ranged combat far more than melee. Their Bolter discipline is particularly famous. Again, they've just got the one character miniature in Tor Garadon, and unfortunately they're arguably one of the very weakest armies in all of 40k right now. Aside from a fairly good chapter tactic that helps out their bolters, their codex just doesn't really do a lot for them compared with just about any of the others. Moving on to go through the more divergent Space Marine chapters now. Next up we have the Dark Angels. They're the Sons of the Lion and the First Legion, and their chapter has long guarded the slightly heretical secret that half of their chapter fell to chaos during the Horus Heresy, and they've been trying to hunt down and exterminate their treacherous brothers ever since. Style-wise, for Space Marines they really go down the monastic knight route, having a lot of hooded and robed models, and many of their number are particularly feared as melee combatants. The Dark Angels are one of the chapters with a lot more miniature support than a bunch of the others that we've just mentioned. The majority of their unique models tend to be either Ravenwing or Deathwing. The Ravenwing are black-clad bikers in their second company tasked with hunting down the Fallen, and the Deathwing are the bone-coloured Terminators of the first company tasked with teleporting in and bringing them to final justice and repentance. The Deathwing have got a couple of different flavours of Terminators. The Ravenwing have quite a few things, including unique flyers and land speeders, plus they've got a big cast of characters. Most of these are firstborn though. At some stage it seems very likely that Games Workshop will give them a big Primaris makeover in the same way as the Black Templars got. Currently as it goes for Space Marines, they're fairly strong in game. The Deathwing are pretty hard to take down, and Ravenwing have some really interesting tricks, as well as most of the sections of their codex just being pretty good outright. Moving on to their bitter rivals from the days of the Horus Heresy, we have the Space Wolves of Fenris, the Emperor's Executioners, and these guys have a very Nordic and Viking theme, and certainly have a wolf fixation, with just about every model having wolf pelts all over them. Plus you can field actual literal Fenrisian wolves and ride them with Thunderwolf cavalry as well. Within their lore, they're a mighty and pragmatic chapter, often coming to blows with various wings of the imperial bureaucracy when they're doing things that don't make sense. They're particularly vicious in melee combat, perhaps in part due to the Canis Helix, which gives the Marines various wolf-like traits and can cause them to full on degenerate into the werewolf-like Wolfen, should these impulses not be controlled. Like the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves also have a very large miniature range, a whole cast of unique characters, some unique vehicles in their flyers and dreadnoughts, plus the vicious Wolfen and Thunderwolf cavalry as mentioned. In game at the moment they can deal out some pretty savage melee damage. As Marines go, I'd say they're at least fairly strong, but that still puts them as one of the factions that's struggling more in Warhammer 40k compared with most of the field. Next up we've got the tragic fallen heroes that are the Blood Angels, a red armoured chapter of Space Marines with a lot of angelic and heavenly overtones, but are beset by a pair of fatal flaws, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, and this can lead the Space Marines of the chapter to gradually devolve into endless madness and death visions of their dying Primarch that was martyred at Horus's hands. When the darkness gets the better of them, they join the Death Company, taking black armour and seeking a noble death in combat, dragging down as many enemies of the Emperor with them as they go. When they make war, the Blood Angels particularly like assault units and particularly jump infantry, soaring through the skies on pinions of fire. Within their unique units, the Death Company and the Sanguinary Guard are particularly renowned for that. Also again, compared with most standard Space Marine chapters, they do have a pretty decent model range as well. Besides their character Mephiston, it is mainly firstborn Marines, and I feel like Games Workshop again are going to be updating their range in a major way at some point, but we don't know how soon that's going to be. In terms of their in-game power, they're perhaps arguably the strongest of all the Space Marine chapters in the game right now. In particular, their Sanguinary Guard kind of carry the codex a bit, just with enormous raw melee power and being very fast and quite tough too. They're almost ridiculously savage in combat with some powerful rules like +1 to wound on the charge and extra attacks when they get into their assault doctrine. Moving on, we've got the very knightly Black Templars. These guys really play into Space Marines as crusading knights. The chapter is an unusual one, being basically on permanent campaign, operating out of great fleets and resupplying as they go to bring the Emperor's justice to Xenos and heretics far and wide. In battle, they fight with mixed crusader squads, with initiates fighting alongside the neophytes that they're training, and often make use of bolters and chainsaws that are chained to their wrists. Models wise, Black Templars kind of feel like a sign of what is to come. They had some firstborn models that were basically updated in full to Primaris. They've got a fair few fun characters, including Helbrecht, Grimoldus and the Emperor's Champion here, alongside a new Primaris reimagination of their Crusader squads and their Sword Brethren. Currently, I'd say they're middling to strong in terms of power, maybe a little bit behind things like Dark Angels and Blood Angels, but certainly have some interesting tools to put on the table with their melee tactics, plus things like Squad Relics and Vows. A pretty cool and flavourful Space Marine army, I think. Lastly, for flavours of Marines that use the core codex at least, there's the Deathwatch. These guys are Xenos hunting Space Marines tied to the Inquisition, and they have special tactics for dealing with the various different Xenos races and make use of some very advanced and arcane war gear, things like bolters with special issue ammunition and the mighty frag cannon. In battle, they typically like to fight at close range, often either teleporting or being dropped into battle by their Corvus Blackstar planes. They often operate as small kill teams attached to other armies. In terms of models, the Deathwatch have a small range in addition to the Space Marine one, a few nice quality Firstborn kits like this Flyer the Corvus Blackstar and their Deathwatch Veterans kit. Currently I'd say they're kind of middling in power for Space Marines. Perhaps some of their greatest strengths are close range damage dealing from their interesting exotic kill team mixes that they can build out of the troop section, taking a lot of specialists from different parts of the chapter and mashing them all together. And weirdly enough, they also seem to be quite good with dreadnoughts at the moment in the rules, having good things for buffing things like Volkite Contemptors or Redemptor dreadnoughts. Finally, and just in case you didn't have quite enough flavours of Space Marine yet, you can also fill plenty of successor chapters too. There's lots of forces that have their own heraldry and rules in the lore, say the Crimson Fist stalwart defenders of Rin's world, the Blood Ravens from the Dawn of War series of computer games that tend to be a bit light-fingered around other chapters' relics, and the brutal melee combat of the Flesh Tearers led by Gabriel Seth. A few of these have their own rules, such as the Crimson Fist and the Flesh Tearers within their parent chapter codexes, and there are some custom army creation rules where you can pick a couple of traits that exemplify your tactics and run them with some rules from the parent chapter's codex. Otherwise, beyond the core Space Marines, we have one last special flavour in the Grey Knights. These silver armoured warriors of Titan are the Imperium's demon hunters, a pure and uncorruptible force that can never be swayed by the machinations of chaos. They have a council of prognosticars on Titan, which predict when demon incursions are going to incur into real space, and dispatch a strike team or brotherhood to cast the demons back into the warp and seal the breach. As basically Imperial anti-demon special forces, they have an interesting combination of psychic rituals and exotic weaponry, and the chapter is super exclusive in its recruitment, as every single member is a psyker to better be able to destroy the more supernatural denizens of chaos. Miniatures wise, their range is a fairly small one, and I'd say that their kits are kind of medium age at the moment. They are Games Workshop plastic kits, but of maybe a slightly older nature. Most of their battle line units are built out of three main boxes: the Space Marines on foot for the Strike Marines, the big and stompy Nemesis Dread Knights to bring down greater demons, as you can see here, and their Terminators. Being Space Marines, and generally quite elite ones at that, they do tend to be at least reasonably good value in terms of price compared with the rest of 40k. Particularly their Strike Squad and Terminator boxes get you quite a lot of points on the board. In game, all the factions' rules are found in Codex Grey Knights, and they've got a fairly interesting playstyle, a fairly even balance between shooting, psychic, and elite melee combat. Their troops can often be a bit slow when they're on the board, but they can get around that with some teleportation technology and their psychic power Gate of Infinity. Typically, a lot of the top lists at the moment tend to use mainly infantry, particularly things like the teleporting interceptors, and maybe some very tanky Grey Knight Paladin Terminators casting an armoured resilient psychic power on themselves. They certainly have got their scary things, including a whole load of mortal wounds coming out from their psychic phase, but currently they are probably on the weaker end of the power scale of 40k right now, just a little bit behind a few of the more recent codex releases. In any case, if you want a psychically attuned army of super elite Space Marine demon hunters, then the Grey Knights of Titan might be the ones for you. Next up, we've got the militant wing of the Imperial Faith, the Adepta Sororitas, or the Sisters of Battle, basically an all-female order of warrior nuns dedicated to protecting the ecclesiarchy and rooting out heresy wherever they might find it. Compared with the Astra Militarum, they're a relatively well-equipped fighting force, with even their basic foot soldiers being equipped with power armor and bolters, though they're also particularly fond of flamers and melter weapons. It seems that their sheer belief and communication with the Emperor does seem to manifest itself in terms of divine intervention and some occurrences of miraculous good fortune for the sisters. Perhaps none more prominent than the tale of Saint Celestine, the living saint who seems unable to die, sustained as she is by the Emperor's will. Miniatures wise, I think that a lot of people are very big fans of the recent Sisters of Battle range. They were an army that were left languishing with some rather ancient metal kits for decades, and then Games Workshop decided to give them a full makeover in plastic, and a lot of their miniatures I think look really good. Price-wise, they do tend to be on the more expensive end of the Warhammer 40k spectrum. A fair few of their units cost a fair amount, but don't get you necessarily that much points on the board. Though perhaps compared with where it used to be, the Combat Patrol box set certainly helps out a bit. I'd probably get a couple of copies of that if I was starting Sisters myself. On the board, they're currently fielded from their 40k codex, and they also have a couple of sets of supplemental rules for a couple of armies like Armated Lady and Bloody Rose if you want to use them. Typically, their playstyle tends to revolve around fragile damage-dealing infantry, jumping out and then obliterating the enemy with things like melter weapons or massive melee. A lot of lists at the moment like to build around Bloody Rose. They're the order that really likes throwing themselves into melee combat, and they get far more damage as a result. Otherwise, they can bring a fair amount of close-range shooting with all those melter weapons, and the Miracle Dice is quite a fun mechanic as well. It means that you can potentially make some dice an automatic 6. It's really helpful for things like big damage rolls or when you're trying to make a long charge. Currently, the Sisters are certainly towards the top end of Warhammer 40k power-wise. They're a challenge for a lot of armies to overcome when they are played well. Overall though, if you want to have an army full of fairly snazzily redesigned warrior nuns burning the witches in the name of the Emperor and some powerful elite infantry, then the Sisters of Battle might be for you. Next up, we've got the Twisted Technological Servants of the Omnissiah. The Adeptus Mechanicus represent the forces of the Tech Priests of Mars and their augmented legions of Skitarian servitors that defend their forged worlds against enemy attack. They also believe that the flesh of mankind is inferior to machine bionic parts, and typically their forces will have most of their body parts removed and augmented with all manner of twisted mechanical bits. The Tech Priests like this one may be going to the furthest extreme of that, being a lot more machine than man. When they make war, they can often deploy some of the mightiest technological marvels that mankind has to offer, devastating exotic weaponry, often making good use of radiation technology, and I feel that maybe overall the faction has a few steampunk vibes, particularly given the new ones with the bat wings. As armies go in Warhammer 40k, their miniatures are relatively recent, nice quality plastic models. The range hasn't really been around for all that long so far. A lot of their squads often make dual kits, fielded as two different units, say for example the Skitari troops that can either be fielded as Rangers or Vanguard. A lot of them are really quite detailed little miniatures, some of them can take a little while to paint. Price-wise, the Adeptus Mechanicus are perhaps one of the single most expensive armies in 40k at the moment. You generally need quite a lot of units to make up an army, and a 2000 point force is generally going to cost you really quite a lot. Their Combat Patrol box set does help out a bit, but even then collecting Admech is likely to cost you more than most other factions. Gameplay-wise, at time of recording they've got their own 40k codex, they've got a couple of supplements from previous past campaign books as well, and in battle they're perhaps best known for very heavy firepower augmented by tech priests and various overlapping buffs and synergies. A lot of the army seems to revolve around stacking things like Canticles of the Omnissiah, Doctrina Imperatives, character buffs, relic buffs and more, and just making some of their units punch far above their weight. They've also got a fairly decent complement of vehicles, plus some elite melee infantry to back them up as well. Typically a lot of forces will revolve around some fairly elite infantry, maybe with a few vehicles to support them. Currently at time of recording, they're perhaps one of the very weakest armies in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop has said that they are going to give them some help at the next balance update though, so we'll have to wait and see for that. In any case, if you like the idea of singing some binaric hymns to the Omnissiah and logically leading a force of twisted mechanical augmented soldiers, then the Admech might be for you. Moving on, we've got the normal humans of 40k, the Astra Militarum, also known as the Imperial Guard. These guys are by far the most numerous of the Emperor's warriors, fighting against a galaxy of horrors with little more than a lasgun and bayonet. Life has cheapened the Imperium, so they can afford to raise vast formations of these, equip them with some cheap flak armour, and send them off to the front. Guards certainly seem to ape 20th century infantry formations. Those waves of infantry often backed up by some powerful battle tanks and some artillery lurking behind the scenes. They generally tend to fight in a bit of a war of attrition, and if the problem doesn't resolve itself, then simply throw more men at it. Within the Imperial Guard as well, there's also the Tempestus Scion Stormtroopers, kind of like humanity's special forces, dropping in with grav shoots and hotshot lasguns to deal crippling blows to the enemy, but there's never enough of them. Miniatures wise, Guard have just had a fairly decent range update, with a lot of their oldest kits being replaced. Things like the Cadian Shock Troops have really waited a long time for an update. They've also had a few returning favourites like Rough Riders and the Kazakin, a couple of sets of miniatures that went away a long time back. Despite this though, the Guard still feels like there's big bits lacking from them. A lot of their older metal regiments got discontinued with no direct replacement, which means that in general if you're collecting Guard, Cadian and Deathcore are the main obvious ones to collect, and the Kaschan kit is still there but very old and in dire need of a resculpt. I'd also bear in mind that maybe similar to the Admech, the Guard are probably one of the most expensive armies that you can collect in 40k. In general, they tend to be fairly hoardy, and a lot of their tanks and vehicles just aren't particularly elite compared with other factions, and it generally means that you need a lot of them to make a 2000 point list, and they don't cost massive amounts less than other armies. I bear in mind that second-hand and third-party retailers that make similar humans in space might also be decent alternatives for them. Both of those can certainly make collecting a Guard army a fair bit cheaper. In-game, at time of recording, the Guard have had a recent 40k Codex update. Hasn't really had enough time to be hitting the tournament scene in a big way, but first impressions have it looking pretty strong. On the tabletop, they're typically a lot more of a shooting army than a combat one. They tend to try and obliterate the enemy with heavy tanks and grind them down with attrition warfare with infantry. Often the tanks will be the primary damage dealers, and the infantry are just there to do the dying on objectives, maybe kill a few things with lasguns if they can manage it. They've got a fun orders mechanic, which means that you can yell at your troops to do various different things, and it gives you some pretty meaningful in-game advantages. And one of their regiment traits can give you a bunch of auto wounds on 6s to hit with born soldiers, and that can make even lasguns pretty threatening, and particularly ones of the elite Kazakin with the hot shots and the extra AP. Overall, if you want to represent a force of the rugged forces of humanity defending themselves against a galaxy of horrors, then the Astra Militarum might be for you. Moving from some of the Emperor's most humble servants to some of the most exalted, we have the Adeptus Custodes, where the Space Marines each had a legion based around their Primarch. These are essentially the Space Marines of the Emperor himself, elevated as much above a Space Marine as a Space Marine is to a standard human. Their historic duty has been to protect the throne world of the Imperium against all comers, and do so while clad in thick Auramite plating, and typically fighting and laying low the enemies with their iconic Guardian Spears. Since the return of Rabute Guilliman, they've been mobilised into a bit more of an aggressive fighting force and striking out further against the galaxy at large. Just one Custodian Guard is a formidable foe, often equal or stronger than many of the Space Marine chapter's finest heroes. Miniatures-wise, again the Custodes are a relatively recently introduced 40k army. They were just in the lore and background until relatively recently. Their models really are quite cool, I think. Lots of really fancy engraved and embossed armour, and really quite big chunky models. Their range is fairly small, mainly revolving around just a few plastic kits, things like the bikes, the Custodian Guard, Terminators, and Sister Silence. At the moment, they do have a bit of a heavy reliance on the various different Forge World units for some unique dreadnoughts and tanks and things. If you're willing to make the jump into some more expensive resin, it does make the army feel a bit more well-rounded. Price-wise, at least beyond Forge World stuff, they are very, very cheap for Games Workshop. Perhaps one of the single easiest armies in 40k to get a force together with. The standard Custodian Guard box gets you a lot of points on the board for how much it costs for Games Workshop, and they've got a pretty decent Combat Patrol box set which gets you a bunch of the most useful kits all in one place. If you do want an easy access points to Warhammer 40k, they're not a bad choice. They've got relatively few models to get on the board and get painted up as well, which also lowers the barrier to entry. In-game, the Custodes have their current 40k Codex that was released in January 2022. On the board, they typically tend to fight around big formations of elite infantry with great armour and quality melee if they get close, though typically they're almost always going to be outnumbered by their foe, unless you're playing against knights or something. You can also build around large numbers of their dangerous jet bikes, or their Forge World heavy hitters like the Dreadnoughts and the Caladius tanks. Overall, I'd currently rate them as a solid middle tier army. Definitely get their fair share of wins against other armies, but maybe struggle against the very top factions in the game. Overall, if you want a force of chunky golden hyper-elite super space marines, every one of which is roughly the same power as another faction's character, then the Custodes might be one to look into. Next up, we've got the big and stompy army of the Imperial Knights. These are a bit unusual within Warhammer 40k, as they're basically a big army of super heavy vehicles, supported by a few lighter vehicles in armigers. The knight households are generally a noble household, with greater and lesser nobles taking big knight suits of different importance, some of them more aligned to the Imperium and the throne, and some of them allied to various Forge Worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Miniatures-wise, the Imperial Knights are quite a recent army. Currently they've got 3 plastic kits, all of them pretty decent quality in my opinion, and they can all build multiple different variants of knights. There's the big Dominus ones with the extra firepower, the Questoris ones which can build any variant, and the smaller armigers, as you can see here on the right, still very much big stompy vehicles, but kind of function like the troops of the army. Like the Custodes, they also have a fairly big Forge World representation as well. There's several other chassis of knights that are made by them in resin, things like the Cerastus and the Acastus chassis. In general, I'd also rate knights as one of the cheaper armies to get into 40k with. you only need to get your hands on a few big vehicles. While the kits are expensive in themselves, when you add them up over the cost of an army, typically they'll work out at a bit less than many of the others. In-game, they have their current 40k codex that came out earlier this year, and playstyle-wise they pretty much are an army unlike any others bar the Chaos Knights. You do get a bit of a different gaming experience with a bunch of super heavy walkers with strong bonds between their Questores and Armigers, so you usually want some of each. They bring a lot of raw power and heavy weapons, and a fun honour system where you gain or lose points depending on whether or not you can do various chivalric deeds. They can be quite quick and punchy to play as well, as you only need to make some decisions for a few key models. I would bear in mind for Knights though, that playing them can be a bit of a different style to 40k games. Currently I'd say they're at least fairly well balanced with the rest of the armies in 40k, but they can win or lose big against certain factions, and might often depend on whether or not the opponent brought enough anti-tank weapons along. That being said though, I think they are a fun army to play. They're currently also fairly strong in game with some big combos that they can unleash on their foes, though as mentioned some armies basically hard counter them. They really don't want to be running into the leagues of Votann or the New Guard for example. In any case, if you want a big and stompy army of basically some mini titans in Warhammer 40k, then the Imperial Knights might be for you. Lastly, for the Imperium, we have the various different Imperial Agents, currently not really an army in their own right, but can make up an important part of some forces. These represent a few different things like inquisitorial forces and inquisitors that might command an Imperial army, allied assassins that can jump in and fill one battlefield niche, rogue traders, and Imperial Navy breaches. They're quite common within the lore of 40k, though maybe just have a bit less of a reputation for being right at the forefront of a main battle line. Miniatures-wise, they're represented by various different kits. The Inquisitors have a reasonably extensive range with a lot of different choices and unique characters. Some of them are quite new, some are a bit dated. The Assassins all had at least a relatively recent resculpt with their Execution Force, and they've also recently re-released their Rogue Trader kit and the Imperial Navy breaches like this one here. In-game, these guys tend to have just a little bit more sketchy support rules-wise. They usually appear in supplements or White Dwarf articles and things. I believe that their current rule sets for Inquisitors and Rogue Traders are in the Warzone expansions, though they did just have a Imperial Navy and Voidsman downloadable rules from Games Workshop's website themselves. And I think that the Assassin's rules are currently the ones from the War of the Spider book back in 8th edition. In-game, they generally tend to be a bit niche, filling some minor battlefield roles, Inquisitors perhaps being particularly interesting for a bit of psychic denial, and sometimes doing psychic actions and secondaries which can be kind of useful for an army. The Assassins often are particularly good at killing one type of opponent, and they've got a rule where you can trade out one for another pre-game. The Rogue Traders and the Breachers maybe being a bit more fun and fluffy inclusions rather than anything particularly strong. Besides a few of the Inquisitors, generally not all that strong, but really quite fun units that you can include in an army to shake up the gaming experience. The current rules certainly allow you to make an allied Imperial force if you want to, taking a bunch of different factions. Might not be the most strong thing in the world, but you can definitely make some really fluffy armies. Moving on then, let's leave the Imperium behind and head into the forces of Chaos. First and foremost amongst them we have the Chaos Space Marines, largely consisting of the heretical forces and the legions that fell to Chaos during the Horus Heresy and made war against the Emperor before being defeated and driven into the Eye of Terror. The Warp Storms shielded them from being utterly wiped out by the Imperium, and within the Eye they managed to build their strength, issuing forth in multiple Black Crusades led by Abaddon the Despoiler, ultimately culminating in the fall of Cadia and the rupture of the Great Rift across the Imperium, allowing Warp Storms and Chaos access to the heart of the Imperium and cutting off the Imperium Nihilists from the light of the Golden Throne. The Chaos Space Marines basically combine the superhuman might and power of Space Marines with dark rituals and demonic enhancement, having many possessed and warp-mutated demon engines within their ranks. The Chaos Space Marines fight in various different legions, each of which has their own character preferences and flaws, and we'll go through each of the major ones in just a second. Miniatures-wise, until kind of recently the Chaos Space Marine range was quite old. Over the past few years though, Games Workshop have given them really quite a lot of kits, updated a bunch of their core units like their standard battle line troops, Havocs, Terminators, Possessed, and much more. Broadly speaking, I'd say that their range is in really quite a good shape now. There are a few older relics like some of the older demon engines and tanks and things, plus their bikers, which could probably do with a makeover. Price-wise, as Space Marines, they generally tend to be quite elite, and therefore you usually get a fair amount of points for your money on the table. They do have a few fewer discounts than the Loyalist Space Marines, however. In-game, their core rules are from the Codex Chaos Space Marines, which not only has their own rules, but a bunch of the different Legion ones in. Death Guard and Thousand Sons, and soon to be World Eaters, they all have their own independent codexes, and they currently operate entirely separately from the main army as factions in their own right. In game, generally Chaos Space Marines, compared with their Loyalist brothers, generally tend to favour aggression and melee combat more so than range. Quite a lot of their Demonkin type units generally tend to like to be in combat more than shooting, and a lot of the more common competitive lists these days tend to build around a lot of Demonkin or Terminators with some nasty buffs from some psychers and characters. They can also make some very nasty combat characters with things like the Demon Princes and Lord Discordant. Each of the legions does kind of incentivize you to build in slightly different ways though, as they've got rather a lot of stratagem support and other options. Currently in game, I'd rate Chaos Space Marines as fairly strong overall, though certainly some legions a fair bit more so than others. Typically the more combat orientated ones tend to be having a bit of a better time of it than the others right now, and tend to get used more by more people. If you want an army of twisted and mutated elite infantry, constantly crusading to turn the tables in favour of the Dark Gods, then the Chaos Space Marines might be for you. To dig into Chaos Marines just a little bit more though, let's talk through each of their legions, at least in brief. I would bear in mind that if you want to collect any of these legions, there's often some good aesthetic parts for many of the Horus Heresy kits that you can combine with 40k things to make them a bit more tailored in that legion's imagery. First up, we've got the Black Legion, first amongst traitors, pragmatic Black Crusaders under Abaddon the Despoiler. They're the ones who masterminded the fall of the Cadian Gate, and when they make war, they're fairly generalist. They quite like Legionaries and Terminators as just some raw strength in the battle line, and on the board they'll typically enjoy playing aggressively. Unlike the vast majority of the other legions, they've actually got some unique miniatures, in Abaddon the Despoiler here on the right, plus Harken World Claimer, the Jump Pack Raptor Lord with the spear. At the moment they're quite strong in game, getting a +1 to hit against nearby units, and having some good things to help out their Legionaries and Terminators. The Emperor's Children are the Twisted Legion of Slaanesh. They're a legion of hedonistic and perfectionist duelists who see them above the vast majority of their peers. They typically make war augmented by various concoctions of combat drugs and blasting out excruciating frequencies from their sonic weapons. In game, they make their Slaaneshi Noise Marines troops and have a fair few combat tricks that make them very, very powerful, and they can also move quite fast. Miniatures wise, these guys are basically the last of the 4 god specific legions that hasn't got its own codex yet, and are basically waiting for that in terms of miniature support. They do have some very, very old kits for Lucius the Eternal and the Noise Marines. I might be tempted to convert from the Heresy era version of Lucius the Eternal though, as he looks a lot better in my opinion. Currently the Emperor's Children are very, very strong in game. Slaanesh is quite strong within Codex Chaos Space Marines, and a lot of people seem to have had good success winning tournaments with these guys. Moving on, we have the Bitter and Dour Iron Warriors, a legion of siege experts, generally being one of the more range-focused Chaos Space Marine legions, dishing out massive firepower and breaking the enemy's fortifications asunder. They're fierce rivals of the Imperial Fist since the days of the Horus Heresy and that whole incident with the Iron Cage. They generally tend to fight with fewer possessed but more demon engines and things. They're an undivided legion, not dedicated to any one chaos god. And on the tabletop, if you want to have a more range-focused legion, they're perhaps the go-to at the moment. Lots of things that make their demon engines shoot a bit better, and the same with obliterators. Currently, as a lot of the range-focused units don't tend to be massively strong in Codex Chaos Space Marines, they're one of the weaker legions. They realistically aren't a massive amount behind their peers. They do have some quite cool durability tricks like a -1 damage stratagem. Next up, we have the Twisted Butchers of the Night Lords. These guys are brutal murderers, following the example of their Primarch Curse. Typically, they most enjoy striking from the shadows, borne aloft by jump packs, lightning rippling across their armour, flaying a few enemies alive, and then scaring the rest of them literally to death. They'll often make good use of raptors and attack from the dead of night. Currently, their game rules favour morale debuffs, something that can be quite effective against certain armies in 40k, but is maybe a bit irrelevant against some of the higher leadership factions. Things like Necrons or Custodes and certain others just aren't really going to care too much. They've got a few melee options and a few dirty tricks that they can use on their characters, like Fighting Last, but overall it does seem to add up to them being one of the weaker legions in game currently, a bit more tricky to make work than a few of the others. Next up, we've got the Sneaky and Duplicitous Alpha Legion. This legion are special operatives, infiltrators, saboteurs, and they foment uprisings amongst the Imperium, often even disguising themselves under the guise of other chapters. Nobody really knows exactly what the Alpha Legion's agenda is, or even if they are truly working for the Chaos Gods or not. They do have a habit of each time you kill their leader, it will turn out to be not the real and most important one. The Hydra indeed has many heads. In game, all their sneaky tricks are generally realised quite well. Their army is harder to hit at range, and they have a bunch of things that allow them to redeploy units get forward moves, and a few benefits for cultists and things. Quite a fun legion to play, maybe a bit more ranged focus over combat in general. While their stratagems and things are quite fun, I would rate them as currently one of the weaker legions. Not really many people seem to take them to tournaments whatsoever. Again, might be a legion that was a bit stronger if a lot of the ranged guns at the Chaos Codex were a bit better. Lastly, for the main legions, we've got the Word Bearers. These guys are the zealot evangelists of the Dark Gods, often covered in heretical texts and make great use of possession and demonic pacts within their ranks. They'll often be led to war by their dark apostles, chanting blasphemous prayers and litanies to convert the masses. In game, they're really quite fun to play as at the moment. They have some brutal melee combat, such as their faith and zeal, and a few really helpful buffs that make some of their characters a bit stronger, and particularly aids any of their demon kin like possessed and warp talons and things, and makes them even more threatening. Currently, I'd say they're one of the strongest and most easy to use Chaos Space Marine legions. They maybe don't seem to win as many tournaments as, say, Emperor's Children or Creations of Bile, though. Again, like the Space Marines, even if you don't want to go down the path of one of the main legions, you can certainly make your own warband. You can either use the rules for one of the major ones, but there are a couple more with rule support: the Red Corsairs, the Pirates of the Maelstrom, and Creations of Bile, the mutant flesh crafters of the Spider himself. The Red Corsairs get to advance and charge, so are really quite quick at getting to combat, but despite that, they unfortunately seem to be one of the least effective Chaos Marine forces in game at the moment. They just don't really have a lot else going for them. They do have their own unique model in Huron Blackheart, though I think he's out of production from Games Workshop at the moment. The Creations of Bile have the one unique miniature in Fabius himself and his little surgeon acolyte. Conversely, these guys are currently very, very strong in game. They have a special rule which allows them to fight on death, as well as some raw speed and damage boosts. Fighting on death kind of makes them into a bit of a counter melee army. They might not be quite as good against ranged things, but against combat units they're going to be punching far above their weight. There are plenty more Chaos Legions without proper rule support as well, things like the Fallen Dark Angels, the Crimson Slaughter, and plenty more. Generally with those you just have to use the rules for one of the other legions right now. Moving on, let's talk about the other big three god-specific legions: World Eaters, Thousand Sons, and Death Guard. World Eaters are basically the legion that fell to Khorne, maybe not too surprising given Demon Primarch Angron's butcher's nails. These gladiatorial implants massively amp up the strength and musculature of the legion, but also their anger and rage as well, and it basically turns them into some of the best shock assault troops of the galaxy. And World Eater's charge is truly something fearsome to try and stand against. Typically, the army will throw themselves into combat. Their most famous unit are the Khorne Berserkers, great big chain axe wielding maniacs who you really don't want to engage in single combat. Miniatures wise, the World Eaters are kind of in limbo. Currently, they've got Khan the Betrayer and the older Berserker kit, but they are basically promised a new kit of Berserkers. These new possessed 8-bound, some cultist jackals, and a Lord on a Juggernaut, plus of course Demon Primarch Angron himself, as we've just seen. From leaks of the Codex, though, it does look like they might be locked out of a whole bunch of standard Chaos Space Marine choices, much in the same way that Death Guard and Thousand Sons can't take theirs. Overall, it would look to be a fairly small range of miniatures for the World Eaters, though I would say they've been realised quite well. Hopefully at some stage they'll have a second wave for them. Wouldn't be too surprised if that materialises sometime in a year or two. Obviously, with their range not released yet, the pricing wise won't really be known too well, but going by armies like Thousand Sons and Death Guard, generally as even more elite Space Marines than normal, they'll typically be okay in terms of the amount of money to get the points and models on the board, and try and work your way up to a 2,000 point army if that's what you're going for. In the game, they'll be represented by their new codex, which should be materialising sometime within a month or two. I feel like they're probably going to be a fairly simplistic codex that just wants to be charging headlong into raw melee combat. They aren't exactly known for their subtlety. One of the leaked rules says that there's rumoured to have a blood tithe mechanic where you kill units to get certain benefits for your whole army, either making them more scary or tougher. Currently, they do have some rules in White Dwarf that make them a bit weak compared with a fair few of the other Chaos Space Marine legions. Really though, we're going to have to wait for the codex to see how good they wind up being. Overall though, if you just want the experience of Warhammer to be charging headlong into combat and trying to take some skulls for the Skull Throne, then the World Eaters might be the Chaos Space Marines for you. Moving on from Khorne to Nurgle, first up we have the Death Guard. These guys are the Chaos Space Marines of Mortarion, whose legion became infested with warp plagues and was forced into a deal with the god of plagues and death and dying. As a result, their marines are kind of in a permanent state of on death, eternally rotting and with some weird mutations, but it does mean that they basically don't die, even when bits of them are shot off that are usually quite necessary for living. When they make war, it's generally slow and purposefully, having a lot of durability and fighting a grinding war of attrition, They use a lot of disease, chemical warfare, and bloated demon engines within their ranks. Miniatures wise, the Death Guard range is really quite a good one. They got a nice and fairly extensive plastic range that came out with the launch of 8th edition, getting a whole ton of very nice kits. They've got their Plague Marines, a couple of flavours of Terminators, 3 different demon engines, and a bunch of characters. Far more support than the Thousand Sons and World Eaters look like they'll have. Aesthetic wise, they generally tend to be Space Marines that have been mutated and are decaying all over the place. Perhaps an aesthetic that isn't to everyone's taste, but I think that the miniatures are really quite nicely executed. Price-wise, I'd put them as middling to good. They are quite elite and have plenty of Terminators, which definitely helps in terms of points on the board, though I would say that their Combat Patrol box set is just a little bit limited unless you want to go full-on zombie horde. I think a lot of people won't necessarily want more than one copy of that. In-game, their rules are found in Codex Death Guard, and their playstyle is generally elite tough infantry, slowly advancing up the board and laughing off enemy fire, all while spitting out a fair amount of death and disease from their bolters and following it up with a charge with some plague weapons. In general, the current codex tends to be a lot better at dealing damage in combat than at range, where they're helped out by their contagions of Nurgle, making all the enemy a bit less tough. They do have some pretty cool supporting elements as well. You can have some Poxwalker zombie hordes to take objectives and things, some big tough demon engines to put out a bit of firepower, or the Grizzly Flesh Mower of the Bloat Drone, and of course Primarch Mortarion himself, a great big angel of death and disease. Currently in game, I'd say they're kind of middling in power, a little bit harder to win with than some factions, but still doable. If you like your Chaos Space Marines to be worshippers of Nurgle, with disgusting resilience and spreading contagions to their foes, then the Death Guard might be for you. Finally, for the god-specific Chaos Space Marine legions, we've got the Thousand Sons. These guys are the Sorcerer's Legion of Tzeentch, and basically their legion is now one that's commanded by arcane sorcerers, commanding soulless automata of hollow armor. Much of the Space Marine Legion is now animated by magic and reduced to dust as per the rubric of Ahriman, in a bid to stop the mutation of Tzeentch from utterly destroying the Legion. The sorcerers are constantly scheming and plotting both with and against each other in great cults of magic, and they like nothing better than enacting great rituals to further augment themselves with the power of the Chaos Gods or allow demons into reality. Miniatures wise, I'd say that the kits they do have are fairly nice. Their plastic range is pretty small, but they do have their Primarch Magnus, some fun sorcerer sculpts like this one, plus some good renditions of their Rubric Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators. They do also have some Zangor Cultists as well, which were ported over from Age of Sigmar, so you can have some Birdmen followers if you want. Price-wise, they tend to be on the cheaper end of the Warhammer 40k spectrum. The focus on Rubric Marines and Terminators does generally lend them to being a bit cheaper than most, plus having a lot of characters doesn't hurt with that either. In-game, their rules are currently represented by Codex Thousand Sons. They do have a Zangor formation as well, though I wouldn't say it's very good. Typically, most Thousand Sons armies will play as a slow, indomitable phalanx of Rubric Marines and Terminators, slowly making their way towards the enemy and firing down hails of inferno bolts. Behind them will typically be a cabal of sorcerers, blasting the enemy with magic and augmenting their troops in various ways, or using magic to teleport them around the board and get a bit more movement. They've got quite a fun gameplay mechanic with their Kabbalistic rituals as well, that allows them to do some sorcerous shenanigans. They can ally some Tzeentch demons if they desire. Currently I'd rate them as a solid mid-tier army, as a standalone faction pretty well balanced I think. I would probably bear in mind that as armies go, they're one of the more complicated factions to play. They do have a lot of psychic spells going on and a lot of options that you can do, but might not be the best thing to do in any one turn. Out of 40k armies, they can be a bit more of a headache to run compared with some. The challenge can have a bit more appeal though. They're certainly an army that you can get into a quite deep understanding of, and kind of fits with their whole lore being sorcerers of Tzeentch. In any case, if you want a sinister clanking army of dusty Rubricae, supported by sorcerers, deploying some unnatural magic of Tzeentch, then the Thousand Sons might be the legion for you. Next up, and from the Chaos Space Marines to the physical manifestations of the Dark God's will, we have the Chaos Demons. These represent the various Chaos Gods gaining access to the material realm, often coming in great incursions when a psychic gets possessed by a demon and unwittingly becomes a gateway to countless horrors within. Their forces are the embodiments of Khorne, the god of rage and bloodshed and warfare, Slaanesh in depravity, excess, and perfection, Nurgle in disease, despair, and decay, and Tzeentch in magic, scheming, and mutation. The four major factions are at constant war with each other in the Great Game, and constantly seek to overrun the material realm and create more demon worlds. Miniatures-wise, the Chaos Demon range is quite a big one, though it is arguably split into 4 separate mini-ranges for each of the Chaos Gods, most of which have some foot troops, cavalry, some chariots, and a greater demon. In particular, they're kind of notable for an absolutely enormous HQ section with a ton of different characters and unique heralds and things, and a fair few of them have had some fairly recent updates, though a few resin relic miniatures remain. In terms of pricing for Warhammer 40k, I'd say they're kind of middle of the road at the moment. Quite a lot of their units actually gained a fair few points in the new codex, so that does mean that getting a full army of them on the board isn't quite as expensive as it was before. They do have a couple of different boxes for discount boxes in the Combat Patrol box and the Start Collecting Slanesh one. Both of those can help out a fair bit. In-game, they're represented by Codex Chaos Demons, and they play a very different army to most other factions in the game, almost like a fantasy army in space. The range does have overlap with Age of Sigmar, so potentially you can have the one army that you can play in two different game systems if you'd like to. In 40k, barring some Tzeentch stuff, they tend to be very melee focused, with a lot of combat troops, and they get some super special demon saves, which are basically like invul saves that can't be ignored by things that usually ignore invuls. They all cause fear, they can all deep strike onto the board, and can sometimes do it unnaturally close to your opponent and get some easy charges out of nowhere. Perhaps at the moment things like Bellicor, Bloodthirsters, Flamers and Tzeentch Psykers are fairly strong choices. Games Workshops have said that they might tone the Flamers down as they're really quite strong right now. In terms of current power, they are a very, very strong army, one of the strongest in Warhammer 40k, though it does sound like that they might be getting a small nerf at least to their Flamers in January, so I probably would bear that in mind. If you're collecting them, you can very much go at making an army for one of the 4 Chaos Gods, or collect a Pantheon Undivided. A lot of lists tend to include mixed forces of Chaos Gods now, maybe a bit more than they did before. In any case, if you want to lead a great incursion of Howling Warp Spawn into real space and drag some mortals into the warp, then the Chaos Demons might be for you. Next up, we've got the Dark Mirror of the Imperial Knights, the Nobles and Mechanicus Knights that fell to Chaos, turned from once noble heroes into fell Crusaders and Renegades, often helping out other forces of the Chaos Gods. In the fall to Chaos, they've gained some unnatural abilities, like certain demon manifestations and upgrades. A bunch of their knights can actually be Psykers and cast psychic powers, particularly with the aid of Tzeentch. And like the Imperials, a bunch of them get to be allied with the Dark Mechanicus, the Infernal Knights able to make demonic packs that cut their health for some massive power upgrades. Miniatures wise, the Chaos Knights range initially felt like a bit of an afterthought, but now actually at least have 2 main kits they can build around, the Abominant kits that can build a few of their other Abhorrent variants, and the new War Dog kit which is really quite flexible, making a whole host of different spiky mini knights. They also do make use of the main Loyalist Questoris kit and the Armiger one. Again, you just need to either paint them in the right style or add some spikes or conversions to them, maybe to make them look a bit more chaos. Price-wise, as with the Imperial Knights, they do tend to be at least fairly cheap for 40k models. The War Dogs in particular tend to be at least fairly good points for the money. And again, in terms of getting a faction practically onto the board in 40k, you will generally have to paint up fewer models to get these onto the table compared with some other armies. In-game, the rules are represented by Codex Chaos Knights, and like the Imperials, they're essentially a whole army of Titanic Walkers and a few big vehicles, and they're supporting War Dogs, which are pretty hefty foes in their own right as well. They've got a lot of raw power, both in terms of damage and defense, and if the opponent hasn't brought enough anti-tank weapons along, they can be in a fair bit of trouble. Compared with the Imperials, maybe some of their most interesting variations are that they get demonically upgraded knights with various favours of the Dark Gods, blessings of Khorne to cut through the enemy's greatest defences in combat, or undivided blessings that make knights tougher. They also have a dread table, which makes a lot of other armies fear them in game, and will be particularly punishing to low leadership factions. It can make them hard to charge or run away. And in terms of competitive builds for the Codex, a fair few people really like to make a lot of use of the little guys and have an entire swarm of War Dogs hunting down the enemy. Currently, in terms of power, I'd say they're a fairly solid middle power army. Very good against some lists, particularly ones that have pretty low leadership for those dread abilities, but they do have some counters. Things like Leagues of Votann, Tyranids and Guard will generally have good matchups against the Knights. In any case, if you want to collect a fell household of Titanic Knight suits to viciously obliterate the followers of the Corpse God, then the Chaos Knights might be for you. Moving on into the realms of Xenos now, and we'll start out with the Eldar. And first up we have the inhabitants of the Craftworld, the Craftworld Eldar, also known as Ynnari, often just referred to as Aeldari, as that was the name on their most recent codex. The Craftworlders are the final remnants of the doomed Spellself Empire from time long past. the centre of their civilization, falling backwards into despair and depravity. Such was to the extent that it led to the birth of a new chaos god of Slaanesh and the formation of the Eye of Terror, which ripped the heart out of their empire, barring the ones that chose to flee on their great starship havens. The remaining Eldar are few in number. The citizens tread many paths, both civilian and military, and often dedicate a large portion of their lives to studying the aspects of war from the shrines of Cain, utterly mastering one aspect of death dealing. When they take to the battlefield, they're often supported by some of the galaxy's finest psykers, arrow-swift jet bikes, and towering wraith constructs animated by the souls of their dead ancestors, and make war in a dazzling blur of speed and colour. Miniatures-wise, the Craftworlds received a very nice range update in 2022, but despite this, they still probably take the prize as one of the oldest miniature ranges in all of 40k, despite a lot of their kits getting replaced. A lot of the new shiny plastics are very good quality, including this rather cool avatar of Cain here, but they do still have an awful lot of resin aspect warriors and phoenix lords and things that ideally do need an update at some point. Price-wise, with a lot of resin around, and a lot of their squads being moderately elite but not enormously so, they do tend to be on the slightly pricier side of Warhammer 40k, maybe a little bit cheaper if you go very heavy on psykers and characters perhaps. Rules-wise, the Craftworld Eldar have their rules in Codex Eldari, where they take up the majority of the book. They do share it with the Harlequins and the Ynnari. In-game, you can field a few different ways of fielding the Craftworld, either taking Wraith hosts or shoals of jet bikes, but perhaps some of their strongest lists at the moment revolve around a hefty contingent of their various powerful aspect warriors, supported by some good damage-dealing powers from their psykers, things like Doom and Jinx. Just in general with the army, they have a lot of tricks for being able to hit the enemy and then jump away before they get to hit back, things like swooping hawks, jumping on and off the board, or battle focus with move shoot move. Generally they need to do that though, as even some of the toughest stuff in their army is relatively easy to gun down. Their aspect warriors certainly aren't tough enough to face up to the raw firepower of a lot of armies in 9th. Power-wise, I'd rate them as currently a fairly solid mid-tier army. Admittedly, it does look like, in terms of at least win percentages and things, Ynnari tend to be a bit more competitive than just raw Craftworld Eldar. But with things like Ulthway and Hail of Doom and things, the Craftworlds do have their power tricks. Overall, if you want to fight a fast and capricious force of martial space elves, then the Eldar might be for you, and try and reclaim the galaxy in the name of Cain. Otherwise, and also within Codex Eldari, we have the Harlequins. These guys are kind of halfway between a faction and a major sub-faction of 40k, the enigmatic guardians of the Black Library within the Webway, making war with a dazzling performance of acrobatics and holographic distortion. Even amongst the elite and well-trained Eldar, Harlequins are on a whole extra level, treating the act of waging war almost like a performance, their every strike perfectly choreographed. Miniatures-wise, the Harlequins range is very small. They basically had a release and then not much after. They've got 3 major kits in their jet bikes, transport, and their main troop squad, plus a few characters. The sculpts are fairly nice, maybe sort of medium age by 40k standard right now, but I think that they do the job. Price-wise, I'd say they're similar to the Eldar, kind of expensive by 40k, fairly elite, but there's no discount sets available for them. In-game, Harlequins throughout 9th edition seem to have had a very good time of it. As mentioned, they share Codex Eldari with the Craftworld, that have some pretty major rule sections contained within, and you can field them as allies to the Craftworlds and the Drukhari if you'd like to. Their playstyle is ridiculously fast-moving, even more so than the other flavours of Eldar, zooming into battle at immense speeds, often on jet bikes or from the backs of their skimmer transports. They hit very hard up close with their melee weapons and pistols, and perhaps particularly stand out of them are the amount of sneaky tricks and stratagems that they have to basically mean that the foes are never fighting them on the same level. Their standard troops have some very fragile stat lines, but multiple different layers of special rules protecting them, to the extent where they just don't really die quite as easily as you might expect. They're certainly an army that can always have the enemy fighting on the back foot. Currently their power is very strong indeed, one of the top 40k factions, at least where win rates are concerned, have taken home a whole bunch of tournament wins. Overall, if you want to make war with a bunch of eldritch performers in holosuits, the Harlequins might be for you. I'd probably bear in mind that you need some insane skill and some patience if you do want to realise these sort of check patterns on the actual miniatures though. Lastly, for Codex Eldari, we have the Ynnari. Perhaps even more so than the Harlequins, these guys are kind of halfway between a 40k faction and a sub-faction. Their rules are interesting, but sort of function a bit like a fancy Craftworld that can take some other units and psychic powers. The Ynnari are a death-obsessed cult of Eldar, worshipping the god of the dead, Iniad. Their belief is that as more of their race die, the god of the dead is gradually growing stronger, and as they become stronger, they'll eventually be strong enough to destroy Slaanesh and end the curse of the Eldar. They're a fairly recent development in 40k lore as it goes, maybe a faction that Games Workshop introduced and then hasn't really done a lot with since, and it remains a bit unclear as to whether or not they're going to take on any more significance within the Eldar range, or be a bit of a past relic. When they make war, they've convinced a whole bunch of Eldar, both from the Harlequins and Drukhari, to join their cause, so they fight as a bit of a combined arms Eldar army, drawing parts from the three major sub-factions. Miniatures wise, obviously most of their units are from the Craftworld's Harlequins and Drukhari, but they do have three unique miniatures of their own: the Triumvirate of Ynnari, with the Incarn Avatar, and Ivrain and the Vizarch. A few kits have some Ynnari specific bits though on them as well, things like the Howling Banshees. Price wise, it means they're kind of similar to the other Eldar ranges. Gameplay wise, as mentioned, they kind of function as a special part of Codex Eldari, basically a craft world that allows you to take some Drukhari and Harlequin units along, and they get access to their own psychic discipline, melee buffs, and the Incarn Avatar in particular is very strong indeed, jumping around the board when things die, and ignoring invul saves in combat. Initially they were perhaps a bit overlooked when the Craftworld book dropped, and a few other things seemed a bit stronger, but following a few rules changes, they now seem to be perhaps top dog out of the Eldari army book besides the Harlequins. A fair few people choosing to play Craftworlds are running them as Ynnari at the moment. Overall, if you want a combined arms Eldari force that's particularly heavy on close combat units, then the Ynnari might be for you. Lastly, for the Eldar, we have the sinister, twisted, and downright evil forces of the Drukhari, representing everything about their race that was bad about them before the fall, and they haven't really got much better since. They survived the birth of Slaanesh by hiding in the webway, their twisted spires of the dark city of Comera spreading greatly throughout. The Drukhari generally make war to raid and inflict pain. Their race is sustained by an endless supply of slaves, death and suffering. Clinging permanently to life is what keeps them safe from Slaanesh. In battle, they typically fight from swift skimmers, with a lot of their weapons primarily designed to inflict pain and suffering on the enemies as much as they are brutal damage. And broadly speaking, the Drukhari are divided into different allegiances: the militaristic Cabal gangs, the witch cults of the gladiatorial arenas, and the twisted flesh crafters of the homunculus covens and their menagerie of grotesque abominations. Miniatures wise, the Drukhari haven't really had all that many updated models for a while, just Lilith Hesperax, Drazar and some Incubi in recent years, though I would say that the majority of their range does stack up pretty nicely against contemporary 40k stuff. Perhaps the most problematic thing about their range though is that really quite a lot of their unit selections have just been removed entirely at the moment. Things like Grotesques, Mandrakes and Beast Packs, for example, they're currently rotated out and you can't buy them on the Games Workshop web store. Definitely miniatures that at some point I think Drukhari players will be hoping that they update. I feel like there's at least some reasonable odds for them getting a fair size release in 10th edition. Pricing wise, I'd say they're maybe a little bit better than some of the other Eldar. A bunch of their units are fairly cheap and fairly expensive, but they do have really quite a nice combat patrol box, which you could easily get a couple of copies of, and that'll give you a pretty credible start to an army. Their current rule set is of course from Codex Drukhari. They do have a couple of supplements for the Witch Cult of Strife and some homunculus covens, but they both feel kind of inessential really. Their playstyle, maybe similar to the other Eldar, tends to be fast and very hard hitting. They usually fight from the backs of their skimmer transports, either raiders or venoms, and they have quite a lot of units that hit quite hard, but aren't really so durable to take a punch in return besides the coven stuff. Power from Pain is an interesting army-wide mechanic that gives them stacking benefits as the battle goes on, and the screams of the enemy amp up their abilities. In particular, their combat units get very quick from turn 2 onwards, as it means they can advance and charge. Currently, their codex was one of the demons of early 9th edition, but a few choice nerfs and some power creep since then, and they're actually a fairly well-balanced mid-tier faction. A lot of their codex is really quite usable, I think, generally in a pretty good place as well as 40k armies go. Overall, if you want a sick and twisted Dark Elf raiding force, dragging some humans back to the Flesh Crafters and gladiatorial arenas, then the Drukhari might be for you. Moving on to more exotic Xenos, we have the Tyranids, an unknowable alien menace from beyond the stars, swooping in across the edges of the galaxy and laying waste to countless worlds, devouring all the biomass on, and moving onwards and finding worlds afresh to feed on. A Tyranid invasion is an apocalyptic onslaught to behold, swarmed of winged critters flocking the skies, and brutal broods of living battering rams like carnifexes, crushing infantry, tanks and fortifications beneath their claws. When they make war, it's typically as a great synaptic swarm, with greater creatures directing the little creatures and providing conduits for the hive mind's will. Miniatures wise, they're a fairly extensive range, but haven't had any new releases for really quite a while. I'd say most of their creatures, great and small, have aged quite well, though there are a few ones that are notably older than the rest. Things like Genestealers and Termagants have a fair few mould lines going on and are slightly simplistic miniatures by current Games Workshop standards. There are a few remaining resin models that could do with an update at some stage, and there are some rumours that they might well be the major antagonist faction of 10th edition. That would mean a whole wave of new kits, probably similar to the Necrons and the Death Guard in the editions before. Currently I'd rate them as a kind of average cost faction in Warhammer 40k. Price is broadly in line with what I'd expect from Games Workshop. Their combat patrol box is helpful if you want a whole swarm of lesser critters, but not so good if you want the bigger ones. In game at the moment, their rules are found in Codex Tyranids. Since the last year or so, they've been consistently one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k, and particularly since their Codex came out, where most of their datasheets just had a whole ton of raw power, and even despite progressive nerfs, they remain one of the strongest factions in the entire game. Their various creatures get to be augmented with various different synaptic benefits, giving them big damage and defense buffs. They're often commanded by a hive tyrant winging around with a brutal relic bone sword called the Reaper of Obliterax. Currently they do remain one of the strongest armies in the game at the moment. A good list played well will generally have a chance against just about anything that they might fight. Typically most armies tend to be at least fairly combined arms in approach, though if you want to go for a few more fluffy builds you can certainly make swarms of lesser bugs or great big Nidzilla lists with big monsters and carnifexes. Overall, if you want to launch an endless onslaught devouring the galaxy whole, then the Tyranids might be the faction for you. The Tyranids seem to be not alone in their quest to consume the stars, as they also have the support of their Genestealer Cult allies, infiltrating saboteurs to bring down the mightiest of defences before the swarms even arrive. The Genestealer Cultists are a mutated strain of alien-infected humans that are rising up within the Imperium to destroy their defences and welcome the oncoming hive fleets. The cults originate with the arrival of a patriarch on the planet, who quickly uses psychic and genetic means to amass a vast army of followers, infiltrating the highest echelons of Imperial society until they're ready to declare themselves openly and make war with the Imperium, often laying great ambushes with looted mining weapons and jury-rigged vehicles with guns. The cult makes use of various different mutated bioforms as well, twisted aberrants to do much of the heavy lifting in close combat, and a whole cast of unique character individuals, each of which adapted to its role within the rebellion. Miniatures wise, the Genestealer Cults are another very recent range to 40k, pretty much entirely new since 7th edition, and describe their choice of kits as perhaps small to medium size. In particular, they do have an awful lot of unique characters, things like Kellamorph assassins, Locust bodyguards, and various flavours of cult leader. They can also make use of Imperial Guard Brood Brothers as an allied detachment, so can get some looted Imperial military technology as well if they desire. Price-wise, perhaps until recently I would have rated them as the most expensive army in all of Warhammer 40k. Most of their units aren't particularly elite and generally cost a fair bit of money, but I'd say that their pretty excellent Combat Patrol box set has genuinely taken the edge off that. You get a whole bunch of the most useful kits of the faction there, all combined into one box set at a pretty decent discount. A couple of those plus this Brood Coven kit for some of the core characters, and you've got a pretty reasonable army good to go. In game, the army is fielded from Codex Genestealer Cults, really quite a well written codex in my opinion, and it does quite well as realising them as a guerrilla warfare army with a bunch of game breaking tricks, but also counterbalance that their units are maybe a bit underwhelming on their raw stat lines, so you generally have a feel of them as a army full of grunts trying to get the jump on a more prepared fighting force with a whole bunch of some very cool upgrades. They've got a fun hidden deployment mechanic where you put down blip markers and only deploy the units once the enemy has declared themselves. You can put a bunch of units in ambush to jump up behind the enemy and then either charge them or shoot them to death. And they've got some pretty fun rules for a crossfire system where if you surround the enemy then you get some massive benefits to your shooting. They can do both range and melee tactics really quite well. Some armies build heavily around one of either. Currently in terms of power, I'd rate them somewhere in the lower middle in terms of strength. They're an army with a whole ton of options, and some smart play can make them incredibly annoying to deal with, but even with the best of direction and their sneaky tricks, they can often struggle against some of the powerhouse armies of the game, and it might just not be enough. Overall though, if you want to lead a glorious revolution in the name of the four-armed emperor, and await the arrival of those mysterious star gods, then the forces of the Genestealer Cult might be for you. Moving on, we come to Warhammer 40k's newest faction in the Leaguers of Votann. It does seem that Games Workshop are classifying them as Xenos, despite their origins as heavily mutated and altered humans. The Leaguers of Votann basically represent the new and reimagined return of the Squats, 40k's retconned race of space dwarves, now reborn anew with a bunch of similar aesthetics, but also some big differences. The kin are a race of cloned space dwarves that make very heavy use of AI augmentation In particular, their society is in part governed and augmented by the great Votann ancestor cores, giving them answers as to how best to make war and expand their prospects. In the 40k galaxy, their empires are clustered around the galactic core, and typically their primary focus for making war is to repel any interlopers and mostly expand their prospects and wealth and fight for galactic resources, whether or not those resources might well be controlled by other races at present. When they take to the field, they deploy a lot of technology that originated the same as the Imperiums, but has been expanded and improved on over the years, typically a lot of their forces deployed with close-range shooting weapons. At time of recording, the Leagues of Votann have basically had their full range launch within the last month or so. For a completely new faction to 40k, they're at least reasonably well supported, a trio of different infantry units, a couple of vehicles, and a few characters, generally really quite nice quality plastic kits with a whole bunch of different options if you want them. Price-wise as well, and perhaps unusually for a new faction, they seem to be on the cheaper end of the Warhammer 40k spectrum. I'd say that's actually partly due to a lot of their rules just being spectacularly powerful when the codex dropped, so Games Workshop increased all the points costs, and that actually means that getting a 2,000 point army of Votann onto the table is a bit more doable if that's what you want to aim for. The Combat Patrol box can be quite a good starting point as well, getting you some core units onto the board. Currently, their rules are found in Codex Leagues of Votann. Their playstyle is largely focused around raw damage dealing power with some great stratagems and judgment tokens. Typically, a lot of their focus will be around stacking those judgment tokens on the greatest enemy threats and then obliterating them with ranged or melee units. On top of that, a lot of their forces are a bit tougher than they would normally be, with some trusty void armor, armor of contempt and turning off wound rerolls as well. And in general, as a faction, they do tend to be a little bit shorter ranged and slower than some other armies, though that can certainly be worked around, particularly if you prioritise their faster units like the vehicles and the bikes. Overall, their current power in 40k does seem to be really quite strong. Games Workshop did hit them with some pretty hefty points nerfs on arrival, but despite that, they still seem to be doing absolutely fine, and tend to utterly ruin some armies that have a big focus on some very tough, durable units that the Votann will happily kill anyway. Overall, if you want a doughty force of cloned and AI-augmented space dwarves fighting for the resources of the galactic core, then the Leagues of Votann might be for you. Moving on to one of the youngest and more fresh-faced races of Warhammer 40k, we have the Tau Empire, a race of Xenos that are characterized by their dynamism and technological innovation, not long discovered by the Imperium, and then after being obscured by some warp storms for a little while, suddenly emerged as a major power in their own right, capable of carving out their section of the galaxy and repelling the strongest forces that the Imperial could muster against them. The Tau Empire are dynamic, motivated and expansionist, colonizing worlds with repeated spheres of expansion and using diplomacy or heavy firepower to win those worlds when they're problematically already inhabited by the other races. Their society functions as a caste system of various different castes doing their own job, headed up by a shadowy and somewhat controlling ethereal caste, who do seem to have some unnatural control over their fellows. When they make war, they're generally focused on ranged firepower, possessing a whole ton of technological marvels to throw at the enemy, powerful pulse rifles in the hands of their basic warriors, and scary railguns and ion weapons mounted on their tanks and battlesuits. They've definitely got some Japan and manga in space type vibes. Miniatures wise, the army's generally got quite a clean armor plated aesthetic. A lot of their sculpts aren't actually that recent, but plenty of them have aged really quite well, and I feel like they're generally quite a good looking faction to this day. There are a few units that could do with a bit of an update though. Some of their auxiliaries have some old resin kits. While they have had some units like Fire Warriors and Battlesuits redone in recent years, they haven't really had what I'd describe as a very big release for the faction in quite some time. Price-wise, I'd say they're kind of middle ground for 40k. Most of their units tend to be kind of middling in terms of value for the points, though their Combat Patrol box set is maybe a bit less useful than the previous Start Collecting box, being really heavily focused on stealth suits. On the tabletop, you can find their rules in Codex Tau Empire. Their playstyle is very focused on mobile ranged warfare, jumping around with battlesuits and fast-moving battle tanks, trying to outmaneuver the foe and gain line of sight on their targets. The crisis suits are often at the vanguard of their army. They're one of the best units that you can make better with buffs from their battlesuit commanders and things, and you can also support them with things like Riptides or Hammerheads. The railguns are particularly scary to any hard targets around. As a rule, they tend to be fairly weak in melee, and that can be a weakness with trying to take the middle of the board early in the game, which you usually kind of have to do in 9th edition. And that does make them a bit more of an interesting faction than one that just wants to sit back and shoot all game long. They've got a few other interesting rules mechanics as well, marker lights that allow most of their units to shoot a bit straighter, drone supports to tank damage and saviour protocols, and their tactical philosophies of Montcar and Cao Yon, either committing to obliterating the enemy as soon as possible, or be a patient hunter and catch the enemy in ambush. Overall, power-wise, they remain pretty strong at the moment. They've won a whole bunch of tournaments recently in the latest season of 40k. Their power is quite significantly less than their initial codex release though. They had a few big changes like broadsides losing core and a few points increases. Overall, if you want an army of Fire Warrior Xenos laying into the foe with all the technological marvels of an advanced alien civilization, then maybe fighting for the Tau Empire in the name of the greater good might be the army for you. Moving on to a very different flavour of Xenos, we have the Orks. Perhaps one of the most light-hearted and all-around fun factions of 40k. These guys are fungoid barbaric aliens that thrive off warfare just for the sheer joy of doing so, often attacking in great migratory wars, stomping the stars beneath the feet of a major war boss and his lackeys. Orks are constantly fighting with themselves, though if they were to ever unite, they perhaps would be one of the strongest forces in all of Warhammer 40k. Their numbers are fairly apocalyptic. They can reproduce very quickly, grown from fungoid spores, and they can make war with just about any technology that they have at hand. They're mad scientists, big mechs, cobbling things together from piles of scrap, and amassing a great army of trucks or walkers before you know it. From an Orc's point of view, they never lose. Either they die gloriously in battle, so they don't care. They smash the enemy, or they run away to have another go later, so war's always a good time for them. Miniatures wise, Games Workshop gave the Orcs a very big update a bit more than a year ago. Most of their army is recent, or at least relatively so. Most of their slightly older kits stand up pretty well against contemporary 40k ones as well. There are a few older relics left in the range, things like the Tank Busters, but in particular over the last couple of releases, Games Workshop have really expanded their buggies and speedwire options, and their new range of Beast Snagger Savage Orcs. Price wise, again I'd say they're kind of middling for 40k. It can be very variable depending on the kits that you're going for. Things like mech guns are hideously expensive for the cost, where things like Ghazghkull Thracker or Stompers get you a whole load of points on the board for the amount of money. I would bear in mind that with Orcs, converting things is pretty actively encouraged. A lot of people like to loot other factions' vehicles and make them orky, and sometimes that can be a money-saving thing as well with a bit of plastic art or some 3D printed extras. In-game, their rules are found in Codex Orcs, with a couple of extra supplemental sets like the Blood Axes and the Speedwire currently. Generally, for the most part, they tend to play fairly aggressively, often wanting to charge their enemy with a whole bunch of Angry Goths units or something. Their innate stats really gear them towards melee, hitting far better at melee than range, though they do have some ranged guns that are pretty effective, just by weight of fire. Toughness-wise, they tend to be hard to wound with high toughness values, but tend to have pretty bad saves, a lot of them just go into war in a t-shirt. And they've got a fun rules mechanic in calling the war, which you can do on one turn, and then that makes your entire army better in a few ways for a couple of turns after that, often making them tougher with an invul save and giving them big boosts getting into combat. Beyond just taking good stuff from the codex, there's a fair few strongly thematic builds that you could play around with. Maybe Green Tide, where you just field tons of boys, Dread Mob for a whole load of stompy orc walkers, or Speedwire with a bunch of bikes and buggies. Or you could really lean into the Beast Snaggers and take a whole bunch of Savage Orcs, I guess. Currently, in terms of power, I'd rate Orcs as very slightly weaker than most. Their top list can do okay, but I feel like you can lump a whole load of the units in the codex to be somewhere along the lines of kind of mediocre but not outright terrible. Lots of units just feel like suboptimal choices. In general though, Orcs are just a pretty fun faction to collect, a whole bunch of howling violent greenskins charging into battle along with squigs and big war machines, and certainly a fun and dynamic army to collect in 40k. Lastly, but by no means least, we have the Necrons, a deathless empire of essentially robot skeletons rising up to reclaim their empire from the lesser races who have usurped it since their long slumber. The Necrons made a pact with their star gods the C'tan to swap their flesh for metal, though not knowing that it would cost all of them their souls while doing so, and even cost the vast majority of the lesser ones any intellect at all, being no more than mindless automata. The Necrons then betrayed the star gods and captured and enslaved them, and retreated to their tomb worlds to last out the eons. Now the tomb worlds are re-emerging. Plenty of them happen to be inhabited by lesser races that feel the effects of a Necron uprising from below, and the various Necron overlords are now setting out to re-establish their domains, purging the lesser races with volleys of Gauss fire. Models-wise, the Necrons have had it fairly good in 9th edition. They were the primary antagonist faction of 9th edition, and a whole load of their miniatures got shiny new plastic updates, things like their warriors and monolith, and they got a ton of new units to boot. Price-wise, I'd say that they're slightly cheaper than most. A lot of the faction is at least fairly elite, and currently you can get a bunch of Necrons in starter sets, the Imperium magazine, as well as their combat patrol box, so discount options are fairly abundant. It's not necessarily all good news. They do have kits like flayed ones, which are just ridiculously expensive for the amounts of points that they cost in-game. You might be better off converting them if you want them in big numbers. In-game, their rules come from Codex Necrons, and they got some pretty significant updates in the balanced data slate, adding core to a bunch of things and making their command protocols better. They do have a couple of supplement White Dwarf rules as well, things like a bespoke army from their cryptex and destroyers. Generally, the Necrons tend to excel best at mid to close range firepower, though they do have quite a lot of melee units that came out with their new range. They often enjoy building lists around the Silent King, their faction leader, who gives them a whole load of buffs, as well as being a formidable combatant in his own right. A lot of the units have some pretty nice durability tricks. There's the good chance that a downed Necron will just stand straight back up after you've killed him once. They are quite hard to remove from the table. Lots of their vehicles heal the wounds that were shot off them, plus they have quantum shielding, and you can even further augment their toughness with things like chronomancers for invul saves, and resurrection orbs to stand even more slain warriors back up. The C'tan are also interesting choices to field as well. Star gods that can't lose any more than 3 wounds in one phase of the game, making them problematic to deal with some armies with an over-reliance on one phase of damage. Currently, Necrons are pretty strong, at least in Warzone Nephilim missions, with some very good secondary objectives that are very easy to do. If the secondaries change a bit, then that would cut a fair bit of their power on the tournament scene, but they still remain a fairly capable faction with some big damage dealing combos if they need them. Overall, if you want to collect a deathless army of robot skeletons, come to harvest the living with Gauss weapons and sinister canoptic constructs, then the Necrons might be for you. So anyway, I think we'll just about leave that there for our tour through the big factions of Warhammer 40k. Let us know which faction you chose and why down in the comments below, particularly if there's any other good reasons to collect them that I haven't mentioned in this video. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, but I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to produce new videos all the time, and if you're looking for more detail with starting any of these factions, I have made a start collecting guides to the vast majority of armies in the game at this point. Feel free to give that a search if you're interested. Otherwise, if you have got some good value out of the video and you'd like to help support Auspex Tactics create more, then I would just like to quickly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find linked down in the video description. All these videos do take an enormous amount of time and effort to make, particularly great big long ones like this talking about every faction, so if you want to help keep them coming, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.